the radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Friday night on the beginning of the weekend. We've all have had a great week and looking forward to a excellent weekend. All right, so not surprising, China's in the news again, kind of dominating the news cycle. It seems right now everything is China, 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 China. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them justified, some of them not so much. But China's everywhere. So China, of course, is being blamed, I think, to a large extent justifiably, for covering up much of what happened with the coronavirus in China in January, maybe even going back to December. We still don't know the extent of the cover-up. We still don't know when it actually started. We still don't know how much of it was done at the local level, at local authorities versus the national authorities. We still don't really know the origin of the virus, and we don't know a lot of kind of the steps that China took during that period. We still don't have complete visibility into what exactly happened. We might never know. It's hard to tell. But clearly, and I documented this in a show a couple of weeks ago, clearly China was not forthcoming with information, was not willing to engage, was not willing to actually let the world know what was actually going on, and in that sense warn the world about what was going on. And this cover-up's been obvious for a long time now. I mean, there were stories about it as far back as February and even going back to January. And there's the cover-up is, so the stories of the cover-up have now intensified. And of course, the Trump administration is making a huge deal out of it. But of course, anytime the Trump administration makes a huge deal out of anything, you've got to, there's obviously other motives involved, and there's other things going on. First, it's interesting. I just saw a video clip of Trump's statements about China in January and in February. And in January and February, Trump was saying, "Oh, they are great. They're cooperating with us. We're getting fantastic information from the Chinese. Everything is phenomenal. They're our friends. They're the best guys ever. Thank you, China, and we're sending people over there, and they're giving them information, and everything is hunky-dory. Everything is fabulous." Right? And then, of course, complete flip, right? Because I think once it became evident that, the United States had failed in its response to the coronavirus, particularly failed in those early weeks of late January through February into early March, then you need a scapegoat. You need somebody to blame. And China's easy to blame because they are, to a large extent, at fault. So there's truth to the blame, but now it's politically convenient. And that's why all the discussion right now is about China, not about the administration's failed response, not about the administration's failure with testing, not about the administration's regulatory failure, not about the administration's attempt to kind of say, "Oh, it's no big deal, nothing really happened, this virus is just like the flu, don't pay any attention to it, or there are 15 cases and we're going to eradicate it really, really soon, we've got it under control," which is what the Trump administration did. But it's, it's a way to divert from all of that and focus on China legitimately, but not exclusively. We should be focused really on in the U.S. response. Alex asks, since China stopped flights to From Wuhan internally but allowed international travel to From Wuhan, does that mean it was intentional? Is it an act of war? So there's some controversy about this. You're stating it as a fact, but there is actually controversy about whether that fact is true. I actually just watched a show, a discussion about this with some China experts. I mean, real ones, not like fake news ones. And it's not clear whether that actually happened. It looks like while the flights are still listed that they flew international from Wuhan, they didn't. They actually flew out of Guangzhou, which is in a completely different part of China, and that some of the logs were not changed. But it's not clear. It's one of those things that we don't know. I think ultimately it'll turn out that it's not true that international flights flew out of Wuhan after domestic flights were canceled. But that's one of the factual questions that we don't have answers to. And that it's hard to get answers to because the Chinese have the answers and they're not being very forthcoming with them. Plus, the other aspect of this that you have to take into account is massive bureaucratic incompetence. I mean, the Chinese bureaucracy is massively incompetent, just like the American bureaucracy is. Much worse than the American bureaucracy, and the American bureaucracy is already massively incompetent, and they're even worse than ours. There's all state bureaucracies, when they do things they shouldn't be doing, are incompetent. So a lot of what happened in China is, not to excuse it, is massive failure of a bureaucracy, massive inefficiencies, and the fact that they can't even get the facts straight about airplane flights is just a reflection of the fact that they're centrally planned bureaucratic mess. Right? So clearly there was a cover-up. The extent of the cover-up. Now, if they allowed international travel, let's just answer Alex's question. If it turns out that yes, international travel did continue while domestic travel did not, then the question is why? Was it done on purpose in order to infect the West, in order to infect other countries? I doubt that. It does not help China to have the U.S. infected. I know that sounds weird, but it does not help China to have the U.S. infected. It does not have China to have its customers infected. China relies on exports. It relies on people buying its products. It relies on people bringing manufacturing and capital to China and investing in China. China is still not a wealthy enough country to go on its own. It's still not a wealthy enough country to see the rest of the world destroyed and ride to the rescue. It cannot do a Marshall Plan for the rest of the world. It just doesn't make any sense for China to export a virus unless it's a grand scheme of somehow taking over the West. But how would they even do that? They don't have the resources for it. They don't have the military for it. The virus is not deadly enough to kill enough of us off to make it easy for China to come in. So it just doesn't make any sense. Now, is it right to think of China as irrational calculations? Yes, I think so. They're not fanatics in the sense of Muslim fanatics who are willing to commit suicide. Let's assume they want world domination. Infecting the rest of the world with a virus does not lead them to closer to world domination. And indeed it won't, and you'll see. I don't think even the Chinese would be that deluded. Now, I guess it's possible, but I think it's unlikely. So the question is, why would they do that? And again, I think it's much more likely to be absolute incompetence, right, that drove it, than it is some malicious intent to launch war against the West, war that they won't even declare, war that they won't do anything about. So I think that China clearly covered this up. Then the other thing that's riling people up right now is that China is providing, has a whole propaganda machine, just like the Russians do, just like the Iranians do, but the Chinese are, I think, particularly good at it. On Twitter or on elsewhere, basically ramping up fake news and false stories in order to incite Americans. And part of that false information is conspiracy theories, including a conspiracy theory that has really upended the life of this woman who serves in the U.S. military, who the Chinese, an official in the Chinese foreign minister, has actually accused her of being the agent that brought coronavirus into China. And they're actually accusing America of starting the coronavirus as, in a sense, an act of war against China. So there's a whole conspiracy theory that the coronavirus is a virus created by the American military and experimented on the Chinese, and it was brought into China by the Americans. And an official in the foreign ministry of China actually has been, I guess, tweeting about this. So, and by the way, there are American conspiracy theory nuts, there are plenty of those, who have caught on to this. And I think they actually, I think the conspiracy theory that America did it, and this particular woman did it, was started in the U.S. and then picked up by the Chinese and reinforced by the Chinese. But I think the origin is some conspiracy theory website nutcase here in the U.S. starting it, and then the Chinese reinforcing it. But the Chinese have a massive propaganda machine. They have to. They're an authoritarian regime, and they have to do it in their own country. And as a consequence, they're trying to shape public opinion, not just in the United States, but primarily, I would say, in the rest of the world. They want to make sure that the rest of the world views China as the victim and views China as the savior. China is going to come up with the best treatments. China is going to come up with a vaccine, which they might. China is dealt with this well. China had few deaths. Look at the United States. Look what a mess they've made. Look what a disaster it's over there. Look at Italy. Look at Europe. Look at the European Union. Look at what a mess it all is. Hey, people, you should follow the Chinese way. So it's a propaganda, part of the Chinese propaganda, to try to convince the world that of the two models, the model of democracy, voting, representational government, and authoritarianism, that authoritarianism is the winning strategy. And they've been trying to export not a communist ideology, but an authoritarian ideology to the rest of the world. It's partially to justify to their own people, and partially this is how they gain allies. They gain allies and influence around the world by promoting authoritarianism around the world. So, and of course, America plays really well into this because the United States has fumbled, has completely, messed up its response to coronavirus, and as the reaction to that is, whoa, the Americans can't do it. The Chinese did a better job. I mean, it's not clear that the Chinese did a better job, partially because we don't know how many people actually died in China or actually had the virus in China because of misinformation. But that's the story that the world is hearing, and that's a story I think a lot of people are integrating. The same thing happened during the financial crisis, and I'll talk about this. I think the beginning of the shift in China towards even greater authoritarianism and towards viewing themselves as a clear alternative model to the United States. I think all of that started in the financial crisis. The financial crisis which originated in the United States, was caused by the United States, caused by our financial markets seemingly, but really regulations and controls of the federal government, but was viewed by the world as a failure of the United States, and more broadly, the financial crisis was viewed as a failure of capitalism. And China said, oh, we don't want that. If that's what capitalism is, that's a failure. And of course, remember what the response was of the Bush administration. We're going to have to abandon capitalism in order to save it. We're going to have to bail out the banks in order to save capitalism. We're going to have to pump huge amounts of money into the economy to save capitalism. We're going to have to do all these anti-capitalist things in order to save capitalism. So it's not like there's a defender of capitalism out there to counter the story coming out of China, which is, look, capitalism failed. What you should really adopt is our system, our program. We're much more stable. We don't have all this nonsense. Now, of course, that's not really even the right story even for China, because China went through a devastating time during the financial crisis. But it won't admit it, and it, because it's authoritarian, can frame the story the way they want to frame the story. So China is covering up. China is providing false information, fake news, conspiracy theories. Some of that is just a knee-jerk reaction to Trump, who complimented China early on, then turned against China, then was involved in conspiracy theories about China, then now is saying maybe there isn't a China trade deal, and his people are saying maybe there is a China trade deal, and nobody knows if there's a China trade deal. So part of this is you've got this guy in the White House that this is the way he operates. Let's play the same game. But part of it is just the nature of authoritarianism. What is authoritarianism? What do authoritarian regimes have to do in order to survive? What are they skilled at doing in order to survive? Well, they're skilled at cover-ups, typically covering up their failures, because they don't want their own people to know about their failures. They're very, very skilled at false information, at fake news, at pretending. They're very, very skilled with conspiracy theories, because nothing they do can be bad. Nothing bad that happens can be their fault. So they have to create an enemy. And in China, the enemy is periodically the Japanese, and often it's the Americans, and sometimes it's the Muslims in Western China. But there has to be some external force to justify whatever failure has happened. It can't be the fault of the central government. The central government is infallible. If it's fallible, then maybe we should replace it. And finally, they're very good at censoring opposition voices, whether those opposition voices are talking about representational government, or whether they're talking about freedom of speech, or whether they're talking about, hey, there's a virus here and you're not handling it, like the doctor the heroic doctor in Wuhan, who got his wrist slapped for speaking out about the virus and ended up dying from the virus. And then the numerous other people who are suspected of having just disappeared, who spoke up against the regime in the context of the virus. But this is the nature of authoritarianism. There's nothing different about China than any other authoritarian regime. This is how they function, and this is how they must function, otherwise they will not survive. They cannot exist. In the light of the truth, authoritarianism crumbles. Authoritarianism melts. It disappears. Authoritarianism can only survive on a foundation of lies and deceptions and misinformation and cover-ups and conspiracy theories and censorship. And that's why they do it. They do it because it's the only mechanism by which they can survive. And they place no value on individual life or on individual rights and so on. Now, what makes the China case so sad is that there was a real opportunity for this to go in a different path. And I've said this before, but there was a period in China in the I think late 1990s, mid to late 1990s, and into 2000s, and really probably until about 2009, 2010, where China seemed to be on the path not only for massive economic liberalization, which they actually did, and opening up the economy and providing kind of a freedom, economic freedom, that to some extent we don't even have here. But it seemed like they were also opening up to more freedom of speech, more internal debate, more acceptance of opposition ideas, of opposing ideas, more openness to bringing in, for example, speakers to speak about capitalism and Ayn Rand, and actually party officials going to those speeches, as they did to mine, and others I know in kind of the free market movement who were regular speakers in China in those days. And I'd say that continued probably really, I think looking back, it probably started changing after the financial crisis, and it certainly started changing with Xi coming to power. But it really started changing about 4 years ago when a campaign to try to silence opposition views started, and really, is gotten worse and worse and worse every single year. The police state aspect of the authoritarian nature of the Chinese regime just became worse and worse and worse over the last 4 or 5 years. And today, opposition voices are muted. They're afraid, or they're in prison. But there's very little opposition within China that's vocal. I know the people that oppose, so they're there. They haven't gone anywhere. But they are muted. They are not allowed to speak. And of course, the Chinese people have not stood up to the authorities, have not rebelled, have not done a second Tiananmen Square, and we'll get to Tiananmen Square in a minute, because they bought into the story. And the story has been that the Chinese authorities have told them. The story has been, look, China's a big country, lots of different people. It's a crazy place. The only way we can get economic success, the only way you, the people, can become rich is if we stay authoritarian. It's if we control things. So leave us the control. Let us remain the sole rulers. And what we promise you is that you will get rich. You will become middle class. You will gain wealth. You will gain a better life. And that's the devil's bargain. Take our money, or take the money that you are producing, right? And leave us alone, right? And I think to a large extent that works. I remember as far back as 2000, I think it was 4, first time I was in China. I was speaking to an engineer in China. And I said, it was 2004 because it was probably October because I was going back, or maybe September, because I was going back to vote in the US elections. I remember that. So I said, don't you want more of a voice in politics? Don't you want a more representative government? And he said, why do I care? He said, as long as I can get richer every year, as long as my standard of living goes up, as long as my quality of life goes up, what do I need to vote for? And that's a bargain I think a lot of people, particularly coming out of severe oppression of communism under Mao, it's a bargain a lot of people would take. I want to be richer every year. I want to be economically freer every year. I want to be able to pursue my economic freedom. I want to be able to make a lot of money. I want to be able to buy the stuff I want. I want to be able to travel around the world. I don't care about voting. I don't really care that much about even expressing my opinions about politics. And from 2004 on, my general sense was, and this is the sense people in China told me, is you could speak your mind. As long as you didn't directly criticize the Communist Party, you could speak your mind on particular issues. I mean, different provinces were a little different. But generally, and I spoke about this. Remember, both my books are in Chinese. Free Market Revolution was published in Chinese. Equal is Unfair, that book back there, was published in Chinese. All of Ayn Rand's books were published in Chinese. And the only one that they hesitated about was Capitalism Not Known Ideal, because there was something in it critical of Mao. So as long as you didn't criticize the Chinese party, you were pretty much left alone. And under those circumstances, the people left the party alone. The problem is that I think, is starting to break down. There is no question that there is a lot of anger in Wuhan, over the government's response to COVID. A lot of people have died. and the way they were treated, they were not happy with. I'm sure there is a lot of angst within China about the horrible, horrible economic conditions that are in China today. People's quality of life, standard of living are really threatened. Economic production is down, GDP is down, imports are down because consumption is down, because people either don't have money or don't want to spend money because they rather save it because of an uncertain future. Fewer jobs, massive job destruction in China because of coronavirus. And because, by the way, not only coronavirus in China, and this is my idea about why would they want to export this? Because by exporting this, they've shut down the U.S. economy. By shutting down the U.S. economy, they have shut down and destroyed millions of jobs in China because we're not buying their stuff. Right? So it makes no sense for them to export this virus and cause themselves economic harm. And you don't have to be, super knowledgeable in economics to realize that that's going to happen. And the Chinese know enough to know that that's exactly what's going to happen. So the Chinese are suffering significantly economically. Now, they started economically slowing down before the coronavirus because of the consequences of all the stuff they did coming out of the financial crisis. They did a stimulus package that makes ours look tame and small in comparison. Stimulus packages suppress economic growth long term. They suppress investment. They distort investment. They keep bad companies alive and restrict or make it very difficult for the kind of creative destruction where bad companies go out of business, good companies come into existence, that process happens. So I'd say over the last 10 years, the Chinese economy has not been doing as well as the Chinese pretend. Not enough people have come out of poverty. Not enough people have become rich. Well, many have. And I think China has grown more and more and more afraid. You see, so many of our leaders and so many of the commentators and so many of the people I see on TV think that China is this confident giant that is assured of its own capabilities and is engaged in the world from a position of self-esteem. I think it's the exact other way around. I think China is deeply, and the Chinese Communist Party is deeply afraid of its own people. I think it's deeply afraid of a revolution. They're deeply afraid of losing power. And they come at the world from a position of massive insecurity. So yes, they're aggressive, but they're aggressive from a position of weakness, not a position of strength. China is not strong in any dimension. It's not strong militarily. It's not strong economically. It couldn't survive economically without the rest of the world having a robust economy and buying their products. Because they don't have freedom within China. And even the economic freedom that they had, that produced the wealth that got them to where they are today, that has also been in decline over the last couple of years. More and more central planning, more and more control from the top, more and more Xi dominating decision making. And as a consequence, China, I think, is losing ground, is weak, is afraid, is insecure. And more than anything, it is afraid of its own people. It's not afraid of the United States. Nobody is afraid of the United States. They're afraid of their own condition. Somebody says, China's debt to GDP is 300%. I don't know if that's true, and I haven't looked at the numbers. But yes, China's debt is huge because during the financial crisis, they printed huge amounts of money. They took on massive amounts of debt. And they're not like the United States, where the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and ultimately everybody wants to hold dollars, including the Chinese. Nobody wants to hold yuans. Yuan is not a reserve currency. And as much as they would like to pretend that they are this mighty economy, they're not. They are struggling. Now, I don't want to overdo this. I'm sure that they're going to be okay for a long time. But you have to remember all their actions are geared more domestically than they are towards us. So why have a conspiracy theory? Well, the same reason Trump does it. To deflect attention. To deflect it on somebody else. One way to bolster your position in power is to create enemies. External enemies. And to raise nationalist fervor. Every time China gets in trouble, every time the economy doesn't do too well, they pick a fight with Japan, or they pick a fight with the US, or they do both, or they start conspiracy theories about the US infecting them, or whatever. Why are they covering up? Because they don't want their own people to discover the truth. I don't think they care that much about the Americans or the Europeans. It's their own people. So you have to keep that as context. So what should the United States do? Well, to a large extent, it's a little late for the United States to do anything. And I would argue that certainly this administration and most past administration had no way to do anything about China, because the primary thing that needs to be done about China, is to remove the moral sanction that we have provided China. The primary thing that needs to be done about China is to call them out for the authoritarian thugs that they are. The primary thing that needs to be done about China is to urge them from the bully pulpit to open up their economy, to free their people, to respect individual rights, to have representational government, to establish a constitution that protects individual rights. That's what we should be doing. So, the only thing the United States, not the only thing, the primary thing the United States should do is remove its sanction, remove its stamp of approval. Hey, you're just like any other government in the world. You guys are fine. You guys are great. Let's deal. Let's sit down and have a chat over tea. Nixon should have never gone to China. We should have traded with China back then, because China was not a military threat to the United States, was not an enemy. But Nixon did not need to go to China. Indeed, I think it's one of the most horrific things that an American president has ever done, to go and lick the boots of Mao Zedong, one of the great butchers of all of history. America should have never opened an embassy in Beijing. And today, indeed, the way you would withdraw moral sanction from the Chinese regime is not with tariffs, not with boycotts, not with calling them names or arguing about conspiracies, all of this. The way to do it is to shut the embassy and open an embassy up in Taiwan and say, when you're free, like Taiwan, we'll open an embassy. It's to withdraw from governmental treaties with China. It's to stop funding things like labs in China, as we've discovered the United States was funding one of these virus labs. It's to treat them like an authoritarian regime. And if American businesses still want to do business with them, their business. If American consumers still want to consume products from them, their business. And for a long time, because there was, and to some extent still is, economic freedom in China, and because the profits were primarily going to private individuals within China, I didn't mind and don't mind buying stuff from China because it's not Chinese. It's stuff made by Company X, by Worker Y. If I knew certain products made in China were made by state-run enterprises, I would avoid those products. I would not buy them. So the solution is for the U.S. government, qua government, to disengage with China and to leave businesses and consumers to make their own decisions, make their own choices. Now, people say, one of the things that's been said about this crisis, oh, they make too many of our necessary things that we need. Well, but that's a business decision. It's not a government decision. A government shouldn't decide about face masks. I mean, maybe a government should have a national emergency supply of face masks, buried somewhere in the salt mines of Utah, so that in an emergency we can pick them out. But it's a business decision where to buy masks from. I think one of the lessons that our business community will learn from COVID is not to stop sourcing stuff in China, but to diversify our choices. So have some sourced from China and some in Mexico and some in Africa and some other places, so that, or some in Vietnam or in India, so that when a virus hits any particular place, you have diversification. So I think we will learn from this, not we as a government, because I don't think it's government's business to learn these kind of things. I think that our businesses will learn. The diversification is good. And then if there are a few things that are deemed unequivocally necessary for national security, then yeah, you could argue if it truly is, but it would have to be objective and truly national security. Then we can make sure that only our allies are producing those and we only import from allies. But that would have to be very, very, very short list of things where the government intervenes because it's a national security issue. Today, of course, Americans want everything to be national security and therefore restrict trade with everybody and determine trade only based on the short-term interest, if you will, or the not even short-term interest, the provincial interests of Americans. Bring jobs back to America, as if that's a goal of anything. I mean, before this crisis happened, we were told by the Trump administration the job market was the best in human history. So what jobs do you want to bring back? I mean, who will do those jobs if everybody's already at work? The whole bring manufacturing back was so stupid. I mean, you could argue manufacturing needs to be more diversified geographically, but that is a business decision, not a government decision. Government has no role in making those decisions. So you're going to see a lot of talk in the months to come about tariffs, about boycotts, about trade restrictions, about trade deals, about bad trade deals, about deals that haven't happened, about restricting supply chains, about dictating what the supply chain should be, that the government do that. All of that is just stupid. What I would like to see is an American president standing at the podium saying, China, free your people. China, stop being authoritarian. China, Chinese people, rise up against your government and get rid of them. Kick their asses out of there. You shouldn't be ruled by a one-party communist party. That I'd like to see an American president do. and open up an embassy in Taiwan and go visit the Taiwanese. That would be moral authority. That would be strength. That would not only undermine the Communist Party, but it would provide fuel, energy, sanction to the people of China. Maybe to stand up for their own rights and to go fight their regime and have a revolution. Maybe we should be shipping copies of the Declaration of Independence into China en masse. Unfortunately, none of that's going to happen. What you're going to hear instead is sanctions, trades, tariffs, all this nonsense. And it's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It's bad for America. It's the wrong approach. Let's continue to sanction the president of China. Let's continue Trump to continue to pretend Xi is his friend, just like the monstrous little dictator of North Korea. And at the same time, let's not let, Americans buy the products they want without a tax put on them, which is what a tariff is, a tax on Americans. But, and tariffs do punish China. They punish Chinese companies. They punish Chinese individuals. And they punish Americans. They punish most sides. Tariffs are lose-lose. Trade is win-win. If you stop trade, you get lose-lose. So, shut the embassy. Right? Stop all diplomatic relations. Stop sending money and treat the Chinese as the authoritarian, evil regime that they really are. That government, though, has no business in determining who I buy my stuff from. Government has no business in telling companies where they can and cannot establish operations. And government does have no business, should have no business, in taxing Americans. Now, again, if your assessment of China is it is an enemy out to destroy America, then yeah, shut them down, boycott them, everything. I don't have that assessment. I think China's too weak to threaten America. I don't think China is an enemy, a military or existential threat to America. If China has not done stuff to destroy American property or American lives, so it's not an enemy in that sense. And therefore, should not be treated as such. Yes, you shouldn't trade with your destroyers. Don't trade with those countries, few countries that threaten the U.S. Only a few. Iran, North Korea, maybe potentially Saudi Arabia. That's about it. That's about it. Let's see the super chat question. Do you think there's a possibility China will call in American T-bills? Well, let's say it did that, right? Let's say China, what does it mean to call in? It basically means they would sell their T-bonds, right? And what would they get in return? What would they get in return for the T-bills? Well, dollars. And by selling them, what would happen to the price of T-bills? They would go down. So they would get less money, and they would get it all in dollars. Now, what are they going to do with the dollars? What are they going to do with the dollars? They don't want American stuff because they have nothing to do with it, because their people are still not wealthy enough to consume our stuff. So what are they going to do with the dollars? They're still going to have to do something with those dollars. What? Well, they'll have to invest them, or they could sell the dollars. They can convert the dollars into another currency. But then again, the same thing would happen. The value of the dollar would decline, and they would get less and less and less money for it. So you see, because we import so many things from China, China then has dollars. What can they do with those dollars? Well, invest in the U.S. But most of those dollars are foreign currency reserves, so they want to invest in the U.S. in relatively low-risk assets. So what is that? It's treasury bonds. If you destroy trade with China, if you boycott them, stop it, then they don't get dollars, they don't buy our bonds. Right? So China exports to us because they want the dollars to be able to invest in our treasury bills. That's not a threat. That's not bad for us. It's good for us. Now, the fact is right now, the Chinese are not buying our treasury bonds. Who's buying our treasury bonds? The Federal Reserve. What does it mean that the Federal Reserve is buying our treasury bonds? It means that the Federal Reserve is printing trillions and trillions of dollars. But the people who would lose from the Chinese dumping their treasury bonds are the Chinese. They would be like shooting themselves. I guess like Trump doing tariffs on the U.S. Very similar. You know, shoot yourself because the other party shot themselves. All right. What are your thoughts? I mean, the United States government should not be engaged in having an opinion about whether its citizens buy goods from country A, B, or C, unless the country is an enemy, an existential threat to the United States. As I've said many times, I still don't see how China is an existential threat to the United States. But I have said, as I said, no embassy, stop funding them. James asked, what are your thoughts on the U.S. government buying Chinese goods? I don't think they should. I don't think they should. I think the U.S. government, core government, when it buys stuff, should only buy from friendly regimes. And friendly regimes have to be, by definition, free regimes, open regimes. So the U.S. government should only buy, I guess when it can, because it has to buy from private businesses. Mark says, the Chinese do surveillance, espionage, hacking. So do we. I hope. Don't you hope that we surveil all these countries and that we espionage? That doesn't make you an enemy. Israel has surveillance on the U.S. It certainly had spies. Doesn't make Israel an enemy of the United States. The United States has listening devices on Israel. I mean, the NSA, just let's be clear here because this is fact. The NSA, this has been confirmed by the NSA to me when I was there. I mean, the NSA was listening to Angela Merkel's cell phone. I mean, that makes Germany an enemy, or we the enemy of Germany? You have to be clear about what an enemy means and stick to it. If you find evidence that they're using technology that you are buying in order to spy on you, then penalize them for that. We've got plenty of laws against that. But again, the decision of what phone to buy, or what TV to buy, or what car to buy is not the government's. It's ours as individuals. Oh no, DDV show, don't bring out all the conspiracy theory nuts with the 5G creates corona. It doesn't create it, it just triggers it. It triggers it. There's a relationship between 5G and the virus. You guys are... So I don't think the U.S. government should buy Chinese goods. I think the U.S. should buy goods only from friendly countries. But I don't think the United States government should buy many things. I think the United States government should buy very little, because I think it should be very little. Should have very few functions. All right, that is my views on China. Authoritarian, evil regime. We should shun it. We should withdraw our embassy. We should have no diplomatic relation. We should encourage the people to an uprising against their government. We should open an embassy tomorrow in Taiwan, and we should use the moral bully pulpit to advocate for freedom and for individual rights. But the government should not intervene with trade. You know that Ayn Rand, before World War II, while Japan was maybe even planning Pearl Harbor, she was opposed to steel embargo that the United States placed on Japan. Now remember, steel is used for weapons. It's used to build aircraft carriers, used to build airplanes. But Ayn Rand was opposed to trade restrictions on Japan, and indeed she believed that that was a way of the FDR to egg them into entering World War II. Now, I wouldn't trade with the Nazis. I actually wouldn't trade with the Japanese. I probably disagree here with Ayn Rand, because I think they were a threat to the United States as Pearl Harbor manifested itself. I know you were being sarcastic. I know you were being sarcastic. I was asking you not to be sarcastic because you'd encourage the people who don't see it as sarcasm, who see it as truth. So I know who you are. I did not think you were actually advocating for that. Anyway, I guess my attempt at that failed. So, yeah, I wouldn't trade with the Nazis. I wouldn't trade with the Soviet Union. I think the embargo on Cuba was correct, but Cuba is no longer a threat to the United States, and therefore we should be trading with Cuba today, even though it's run by communists, even though it's an evil regime. If people want to trade with Cuba, that is a decision individual Americans need to make about whether they're willing to trade with Cuba or not. Not a decision that the U.S. government should make. So, U.S. government is only interested in enemies, allies, everybody in between. Enemies, shunned completely, embargoed, no trade. U.S. citizens are not allowed to go there. You could be viewed as a spy if you communicate with them. Your communications could be tracked. They are the enemy. Allies, we have embassies, we have relationships, we have all kinds of deals. We cooperate, we create a little united, not nations, but united free nations. We have a united WHO, but not W, but just Free Nations Health Organization. We do all that with the free nations. The middle, we most part ignore. The government has no business there. If the country is either not helping secure individual rights or threatening the security of individual rights of Americans, the core government has no business with them. Now, I know this is a completely different view of foreign policy than anybody else out there has articulated. But it is what it means to have an American foreign policy that is a foreign policy focused on American self-interest, which means an American foreign policy focused on the protection of individual rights of Americans. All right. What is stopping China from invading Taiwan? Nothing. And I think that the biggest risk moving forward, given American weakness and given America's lack of focus and given America's encouragement of the Chinese regime and emboldening the Chinese regime by focusing on stupidities like tariffs, is that as China gets more and more into economic problems, as politics in China deteriorates and there's a potential of civil unrest and maybe civil uprising, then as I said before, China needs an enemy. China needs to look outside. China needs to rally the nationalistic fervor of the Chinese people. And nothing could do that more than invading Taiwan. And of course, they would be calling America's bluff. Will we go to war with China over Taiwan? We have a treaty with Taiwan that says we will, but will we? I don't know. Should we is a different question. Will we? Should we have the treaty is a different question. If you have a treaty, you should live up to the treaty. Yes, the United States has a defense treaty with Taiwan that it will support it if China attacks it. But should we have that treaty? I don't think so. Would we go to war with China if China attacked? I don't think we would. And China has to make that calculation. Now, I don't think it's attacking Taiwan, because even though we wouldn't defend it, we would embargo it, we would stop trading with it, we would penalize it economically, and they can't afford that at this point. But again, when China gets into real economic problems, and if China thinks, if the Communist Party in China, if the ruling party in China thinks, that there's going to be civil unrest and an uprising against them, that's when I think Taiwan should be worried. I don't think they should be worried before then. Can you compare Taiwan to Hong Kong? I'm not sure in which dimension. I mean, very different cultures, very different places, both Chinese, obviously. But Hong Kong ruled by the British, British rule of law, British freedoms. They could never vote, but they always had the right of free speech and all the other freedoms that were instituted by the British. Taiwan, and therefore, one of the most freest economies in the world, one of the two freest economies in the world. Taiwan was founded by a fascist, basically, by the opposition to the communists, his name now escapes me. Somebody on the super chat will tell me. But by basically a nationalist, but authoritarian, who founded Taiwan in opposition to the communists, and escaped from mainland China to Taiwan to found it, not as a separate nation. His view was one day he would rally enough forces and go back and conquer China. Was authoritarian for a long time. Chiang Kaishek, thank you. Chiang Kaishek was of course the authoritarian. It was an authoritarian and ruled Taiwan with a heavy hand, dominated and central planned, and Taiwan was relatively poor until somewhere around the 60s, where I think he died and there was a regime change and they started freeing up the economy and ultimately freed up the political system. And Taiwan drifted towards a free economy, and as a consequence became richer and richer and more successful, and really one of the Asian tigers, together with Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea, became an Asian tiger. But it became an Asian tiger starting in the 70s probably, as it freed up the economy, as Chiang Kai-shek's grip and power disintegrated, fell away, and ultimately became a representational government that respects rights for the most part. So a free country with elections. Hong Kong has no elections. Mostly economically free, but nowhere near as economically free as Hong Kong is. So that's the comparison. Both claimed, on both places, the Chinese government has a claim that they are part of China. Hong Kong was never independent. It was always part of the UK under a lease agreement. And because of that, when the lease ran out, the Chinese could claim it back. And the UK gave it back to them under some agreement of one nation, two systems until, I think, 2034, I think, or something like that, which is coming up when the Chinese take full control over Hong Kong. Taiwan declared itself an independent nation, and for a long time was viewed internationally as an independent nation. Was in the United Nations, in the WHO, in the United States, and an embassy there, until Nixon went to China and brought China into the international community, brought them to the UN, established a diplomatic relationship with China, did all that, and by doing that, gave the Chinese the moral backbone to demand that the world reject Taiwan, which is what happened. So Taiwan is an independent country, the only independent country in the world, not represented in the United Nations. Why? Because the Chinese demanded. And we are all cowards. This is why that, I think, is so much more important. Things like that are so much more important than tariffs. It's just stupid. So, yeah, the whole thing is a moral inversion, a moral, pragmatist inversion of placing China more important than Taiwan. But Taiwan is a good country, as countries go. Why would spying on an ally be necessary? Well, I don't think it's necessary, but that's what we do. I asked them at the NSA. So I don't know if I told you the story. Some of you know the story, because I've told it on the show before. You know, I'm not supposed to say what happened at the NSA. I now remember that I was asked not to say what happened at the NSA. But I'll say this. I was at the NSA's invitation. I spent a day there where they tried to convince me they were the good guys. And my criticism of them was justified. They did not succeed in convincing me of that. And one of my arguments was about Angela Merkel, for example, and they had no answer to that. Their answer was, our bosses, the politicians, wanted us to do it, so we did it. That's their answer. Why should we spy on an ally? We shouldn't. The excuse there was, we wanted to know what Angela Merkel was thinking about Putin. This is during the Ukraine thing. This is under Obama. And we wanted to know what Angela Merkel was thinking about China and Ukraine. Well, if they're an ally, just ask. All right. Let's see. Just a comment in support. Our Trudeau government in Canada is so disgraceful. The Minister of Foreign Affairs would not even say the name Taiwan when pressed. It was so ridiculous and irrational. Complete evasion of reality and morality. That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's disgusting. And it's the same kind of evasion that we, in dealing with the Muslim world. Same kind of evasion that we deal with Saudi Arabia. Could China ever ally with North Korea? I mean, they already allied with North Korea. And in some sense, I think North Korea is a pest a little bit to China. I don't think China likes having North Korea where it is, and North Korea kind of threatening the United States. I mean, I don't think China likes that because it puts too much focus of the U.S. on that part of the world. But China is to a large extent an ally. It's the only trading partner North Korea has. It's the only reason North Korea is sustained. And if you want to really go after North Korea, what should have been done was significant pressure should have been applied on the Chinese against North Korea. And when the little dictator of North Korea, the murderous dictator of North Korea, was rumored to have died, I think the Chinese would probably ultimately land up taking over North Korea, or at least increasing their influence on North Korea and trying to put a regime in there that was more moderate but was controlled by them. Because they view North Korea as a buffer between U.S. troops in South Korea and China. And they're against Korean unification, because Korean unification, in their view, would put U.S. troops on the Chinese border. So they want to keep North Korea. They just would like it, I think, not to be with this particular murderous dictator. They'd like a dictator that they can more easily control. That's my view of China and North Korea. Vietnam seems to be our ally against China. How should the U.S. government treat the Vietnamese regime? The same way as I expressed they should treat the Chinese regime. The Vietnamese regime is an anti-individual rights, anti-freedom, authoritarian regime. We should not have an embassy there. Again, we should trade with them. We should, as individuals, a company should decide what to do with them. But the U.S. government should condemn them as it condemns every authoritarian regime on planet Earth. That should be part of one of the main responsibilities of an American foreign policy. Should be the condemnation of authoritarianism in all its forms, from kingdoms in Saudi Arabia to Communist Party rule in Vietnam and in China. And since we're not at war with China, we don't need allies. And if we were at war with China, I don't think Vietnam would be a good ally. The enemy of my enemy is not always my friend. TSMC is an important entity in Taiwan. They make a lot of important semiconductor products. Absolutely. I mean, Taiwan is a hub of technology and semiconductor and A lot of technology stuff is in Taiwan. If you want to protect your IP, then you go to Taiwan or Thailand, not to China. If you had to move to Asia, which country would you pick based on freedom and lifestyle? That's a tough one. It depends on what context I was moving to Asia, right? So obviously in the past I would have picked Hong Kong. One would consider, and I know people, Americans who live in Singapore and love it because the economic freedom is amazing, but I would not be happy in Singapore because of the restrictions on freedom of speech. I've never been to Taiwan, so I don't know. Thailand's an amazing place, but it's not exactly economically free, and it's corrupt, and I love the people, I love the friendliness, I love the food, but I don't think I could actually live there. Maybe in a resort town on the beach somewhere. It's not easy because the culture is very different in these places. And look, there is no ideal place in the world. But Hong Kong and Singapore have to be at the top of the list. Hong Kong is in decline, so that's a tough one. And Singapore has these restrictions on freedom of speech, which is a real problem for somebody like me. Do you think the population growth of a society can have an impact on the changing values of society? In other words, as a country population grows, do you think people can lose empathy towards the individuals within? I don't see any evidence of that. I mean, the population of the United States grew dramatically in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and I don't think it lost empathy. And it grew both through immigration and through childbirth. No, I don't think that has to do. I think, again, all these attitudes have nothing to do with demographics. They have everything to do with ideas. History, culture, the world is shaped by ideas. I mean, there is a case to be made that as, I don't know, populations age, their values change. Risk tolerance changes. View of the future changes. So Japanese culture, which has a lot of old people, very conservative, very dull, very protective, very risk averse. But I think young people fight that. So there's a young people culture in Japan that's fighting that and resisting that. So I think at the end it is ideas and not demographics. I don't think demographics destiny. I don't think demographics matter. I think what matters is the ideas that people hold. Is China's policy to create empty ghost cities for jobs and for the poor to move working? Looks like a classic Austrian malinvestment housing bubble. Yes, but what happens is there is massive malinvestment in China. Has been for decades. But the empty ghost cities they're overplayed, right? But this is why they build them. Every province in China is measured by GDP. So, you know, the executives are measured by the central government by how well GDP in that province does. Well, GDP is a measure that grows if government spends a lot of money. So one of the things that happens in these provinces, if they want to boost GDP, is they go and they build ghost cities. And that's what they did. And it boosted GDP, and the national government passed them on the shoulder. Now, at the same time, they usually also have this economy, this free market economy, more like a free market economy in the background. And because these ghost cities are cities, big cities that have these marketplaces and manufacturing and jobs are being created. People are moving in there. And the ghost cities ultimately fill up. But yeah, the Austrians would say, if you had not built the ghost cities, if you had returned that capital to the private sector, more jobs would have been created, faster, and those ghost cities would have been built in the end, but would have been built when the demand was there for them. And they would have been built in a healthier way, and they would have been built by the private sector, and GDP would have gone up much, much more, ultimately. So these artificial games actually slow growth, slow the economy, create bubbles, create problems. But bubbles can be filled in if there's lots of economic growth going on in the background. So you don't notice when the bubble pops because the economic growth goes from, let's say, 10% to 8%. Who noticed that? But imagine if it had gone at 12%. Whoa! The difference between 12 and 8 is huge. But you never see that difference. I mean, that's true in the United States as well. One of the things that hides all the bubbles that have been created by government policy in the United States is productivity growth, real production. What about Gegenhaven in North Aegean Sea? That's a nice place. It was never reclaimed by Greece after the Second World War. I don't know what that is. Sorry. Is it a country? Is it like one of these little European countries? What would I do there? I just don't know what it is. Sorry. Is giving China and Russia special status on the UN serve any purpose? Yes. It serves the purpose of complete and utter moral bankruptcy of the United States. The UN should not exist in this format. They should be united free nations, which should be an organization of free countries. But an organization that has Russia, China, or think about Russia under communism, China under Mao, and the United States all as equal members is a corrupt, disgusting, horrible organization. A United Nations that has Saudi Arabia and Iran and Venezuela or Libya serving on the Human Rights Commission is a disgusting organization that should be eliminated. I've always said, put them on a boat and let them set up shop in Caracas or in Riyadh, but not in the bastion of freedom, New York City. But that is the United States. We have no moral backbone. We have had no moral backbone when it comes to foreign policy, maybe in our entire history. I don't know that we've ever had a completely rational foreign policy. Maybe the Monroe Doctrine is the closest we've come to it. You owe me $5 for an unanswered question, therefore this is worth 10. Do you think we're in for a new FDR-like New Deal? Quite possible. I mean, we've already spent more money than FDR ever did. FDR didn't spend $2.2 trillion, even in the dollars of the time. So we already outspend the New Deal. But yes, I can imagine this infrastructure project is going to be just as big as FDR's dam building projects and road building projects of the 1930s. In a sense, there's a sense in which we have a New Deal every budget because we spend so much on these things. But think about the Green New Deal, infrastructure spending. All these big, lavish government programs are all mini New Deals. And if you add to that kind of the regulatory regimes that come out of crises like this, the new trading regimes with massive tariffs, all of that is New Deal-like in a sense that it grows government's power over our lives. And sorry I didn't answer that question in the past. I guess somehow I missed it. I apologize. James Woodsworth. Okay, these are the last two questions. No more super chat, please. Your thoughts on nation states as such. I'm a supporter of nation states. I just don't think there should be this many. Ayn Rand wrote a brilliant essay on global balkanization. I think she wrote it in the 1960s. And it's just tribalism. So I believe in nation states. Nations united under a constitution that articulates the principles that govern that states. There should be very few states. I mean, I think South America should have two countries. I think North America, the United States and Canada should be one country. I think Europe should be mostly one country. I just don't see these multitudes of puny little nation states as being justified. I think countries are important. Having more than one is crucial. Having many, 50 sounds like a good number. Because you want variety, you want choice, you want to be able to escape from one to the other. But having 200 and something, overkill, way overkill. And it leads to collectivism and tribalism and ultimately to war and destruction. Pompeo asked China to allow the U.S. to investigate how COVID started. They, of course, refused. Should we demand entry and go in forcibly to get to the bottom of this pandemic? Do you have sovereignty? No, I don't think we should. And it's not because they have sovereignty or don't. They don't in a sense that they're an authoritarian regime. But it's not in our self-interest to have a bunch of young Americans die in a war and potentially have tens of millions of people die in a war because a nuke would a nuclear war could develop with China. In order to discover the truth behind this, it's just not worth it. So it just doesn't justify going to war for. So, I think we'll get to the bottom of this pandemic because I think the science will get us there. We'll figure it out. I think the truth will leak ultimately out of China, and our detectives will figure it out. But no, these are not the kind of things you go to war over. A war you go over when there is an existential threat to your people, when a war has to be a war of self-defense. The fact that they covered it up, well, the Trump administration covered this up for 6 weeks and didn't tell us the truth, the American people, for 6 weeks. Should we have a revolution over the pandemic? I mean, I think there are like 50 other things that we would have a revolution on before that. How does private equity impact the current market? Will things become more consolidated or will industries become more fragmented? How does consolidation or fragmentation determine American future? Hard to tell. Probably more consolidated in the short run. And then beyond that, it will be determined by the regulatory regime that we have in place, right? So the competitive nature of American business is determined by regulation. The more regulation there is, the less competition there is. The more regulation there is, the more some industries are protected. Regulations protect those industries. I think private equity is essential to coming out of this healthy. So one of the things private equity does is it goes into a family business that might be struggling right now because of the coronavirus, provide them with capital and help them to grow. And then at some point sell their stake to some of the shareholders back to the family or in the stock market or whatever. Another way private equity could manifest is a company that's about to go bankrupt. They could go in, buy out the finders completely, take over the company, restructure it, and put it on better footing in order to survive. So I think private equity is an essential feature, an essential element in an economic recovery for the United States. I don't think we could recover without private equity. But I also think a lot of players will be in the market right now to buy struggling businesses and consolidate them. So you'll get consolidation. But I've never viewed consolidation as a bad thing. I don't think market concentration one way or the other matters. What matters is it a product of freedom or not? So what I would like to see is more freedom. I would like to see less regulations. I would like to see the government shrink dramatically. And then let concentration of business be whatever it happens to be. Freedom is what matters. All right. I'll have to do a show on private equity sometime. I think I've promised that in the past. It's a big topic, an important topic, and a misunderstood topic. I spoke about it quite often in the past when Mitt Romney was running for president because he was from private equity and he never made that a point of pride. All right, thanks everybody. Hope you enjoyed the show today. If you did, please press the like button. It doesn't cost you anything to press the like button. Share it with your friends, anybody interested in China. I think this is a topic on the top of people's minds. Even if they don't agree, it'll get them thinking. And expose them to a completely different approach to foreign policy. And, tune in tomorrow. Tomorrow at, I need to figure out the time. Let's say tomorrow at, I will be either 1 or 2 p.m. Here it is, 1 p.m. Tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be chatting with James Tooley. James Tooley wrote an unbelievable book years and years ago called A Beautiful Tree. And we will be discussing privatizing education. In particular, we will be discussing private education in poor countries. Private education for poor people. Can poor people afford Private education. If you privatize the educational system, what would poor people do? That's the expertise of James Tooley. He is the world expert on this, and we will be talking about it with him tomorrow at 1 o'clock, right here, same place, different time. Join us. Let people know. It'll be a great show. Bye, everybody. See you then.